Thanks, Daryl, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Commodity Classic virtual experience from DEKALB and Asgrow. My name is Colin Pennington, and with me this afternoon is technical agronomist Jamie Long. Jamie, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Hey, we're really certainly disappointed we're not here with you all in person in San Antonio this year, but exciting conversation today nonetheless as we start to talk about high yield management and what that really means and some of that practical on-farm applications. And so we've got a lot of things to talk about: planting timing, yield management from a seed treatment perspective, from a weed management perspective. Now, before we get started, we're going to talk about planting early, but I don't think we're going to talk about planting as early as our friend Jason Carr, who planted some soybeans back in November 19th.
Right, yeah.
I don't know what's going on there, but for those of you who don't follow along on Twitter, make sure you follow along. One of our technology development reps and our team in Illinois doing a lot of fun research along the lines of this, but to be a little more practical, let's go ahead and get this conversation started.
I'm not sure if that's fall of 2020 planting or 2021 planting at that point.
Yeah, I don't really know either, but the first piece of this is definitely the thoughts around when to plant and when the right time to maximize that crop's yield potential is from the time we put it in the ground. So Jamie, tell us a little bit about your data and some of the expertise that you have and what we've noticed in planting date and kind of making that application. We always have talked about corn and trying to get corn early, but maybe that's not always the right first answer.
Yeah, so high yield management can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And really to set yourself up for, that high yields at the end of the year, that's gonna start right from the get-go, right from the beginning. So when we have really good planting timings, conditions, that really sets our crop up for success at the end of the year. We're speaking about soybeans a little more particularly today, because I really want to emphasize about planting early or planting timely with soybeans. I think that, a lot of growers are starting to try that, and it's really been successful. A lot of the data really shows that. This research that I have here, this is from some Illinois data that we have looking at node counts throughout the year at different planting timings. And so when we look at these node counts, it really is quite linear and lines up really good with what we see out of yields too. So overall, when we have these earlier plantings, we see more vegetative growth of these soybeans. That's going to equal more nodes. And of course, where we have more nodes is more spots on the plant that we can have pods and then ultimately beans, which leads to yield. So really trying to push that or emphasize planting early, really to increase those node counts. And I think that we see that here out of this data, which ultimately leads to yield at the end of the year.
Well, and it's all about the bushels, right? And so tell us a little bit about some of that data from a yield perspective, especially when we look at corn, right? Because first of all, when we talk high yield management, a lot of what we first jump to is corn. But then we also think about that early planting window. And certainly, as you said, a lot of folks have been trying this on their own over the last couple of years anyway, but that soybean plant is maybe a little tougher than we think. And so maybe that window of opportunity to create some operational efficiency and get some beans in the ground ahead might pay off a little more than we've previously expected.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you go to any high yield management conversation or talk with regards to corn, we really are targeting a nice even stand, really want the conditions to be correct to get that nice even stand with corn. That's going to be critical from a high yield management perspective with corn. And I think that we see that here in this data here. So, if we look at that trend line for soybeans versus corn, we have a lot more flexibility or a wider window where we see really nice stability out of that soybean yield than we do maybe with corn, where, a lot of guys, when we're talking about the two things that I focus on as far as when it's time to plant is going to be moisture and soil temperature. And for beans, I'm kind of targeting within that 50-degree mark and kind of a warming trend. Of course, with both crops, I want planted into adequate soil moisture, not trying to beat the rain and get out there and just get it in the ground. We really want to be thinking about what the weather's going to be doing in the future. And a lot of the high yield management guys that I work with from a corn perspective are maybe waiting till that soil is a little bit warmer, more in that 55-degree mark. For corn. And I think that really sets us up. We can get out with the beans early, perhaps, wait a little bit on the corn, make sure we get that nice even stand with the corn, nice even emergence. And with soybeans, I can have a little bit of fluctuation or lose a little bit of population and still have a very good stable yield. And with corn, I'm really wanting that full stand out there of very even plants from the get-go.
All right, so, I mean, looking at this graph, you've got soybeans going in the ground as early as March 7th. It's March, what, 3rd today? I mean, that's really soon.
Yeah.
We're exposing ourselves to a lot of extra stress with these seeds. So maybe talk a little bit about what are the things we need to do up front to try to better anticipate that from a seed treatment perspective, because I think as we've gone through the years, certainly we've ebbed and flowed, and where's the value sit with seed treatments and soybeans to it kind of becoming almost standard practice. But now I think as we look at being smarter about our agronomic practices, and if we want to plant earlier, that opportunity for seed treatments to help us out is exponentially larger.
Yeah, so seed treatments have definitely made strides here in the last few years, and especially on the soybean side. And as we're starting to plant earlier, we really see that separation between untreated seed and having treated seed out there really come to life. So you can see from this graph here, as we're planting earlier, that distance between the maximum yield between treated and untreated seed really becomes apparent. When we're planting earlier, of course, we're probably planting into some of those cooler and wetter soil conditions, and that's really going to be ripe for those early season seedling diseases. So having a fungicide component of your seed treatment is going to be really critical. And then from the other perspective, having a good insecticide is really critical as well. So especially as the first fields maybe that are going to be emerging, you can have below ground insects and also above ground insects. I know in Illinois last year, we ended the season with a high population of bean leaf beetle out there. So, having that insecticide treatment, especially when planted early, is definitely going to help that bean from an insect protection. And then as we're planting early in my neck of the woods here in southern Illinois, SDS or sudden death syndrome is something that is definitely of concern planted into those cool and wet conditions. And so I definitely recommend, as we're planting earlier, to have that fungicide insecticide component, but also be planting a product that has good tolerance to SDS, or adding that additional protection with an SDS protected seed treatment.
All right, so moral of the story here, I think, is planting early can be good for both crops, but the actual window we have and the timing and the conditions is probably a little more critical on the corn side, towards we can get a little more of that extended benefit by widening our window on soybeans.
Yeah, and beans are definitely tougher than I think people give them credit for.
Well, I mean, you can think through, I even remember last year, especially in parts of Illinois and Missouri here, the late frost we had and some of the folks that were already planting early with some pretty big concerns around what was that going to do to the soybean crop. And I think at the end of the day, we found they're maybe a little tougher than we realized. So moving on from some of that early season stuff, and maybe even moving ahead really, before we even get to that, talk a little bit about product selection. What are the things we need to look for from a plant type perspective, an agronomic perspective, if one of the strategies we want to impart is getting that seed in the ground earlier?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I look for as an agronomist when I'm coming up with what products do I recommend locally for early planting scenarios. A couple agronomics that I look for is, one, we already hit on this, so you're going to have that increased vegetative growth, more nodes, possibly more pods, more beans. That's a lot of weight for that bean to support. So what I'm looking for is agronomically a plant that has good standability, something that's going to stand throughout the season, because I know there's nothing worse than getting out to harvest and having to harvest a field of down beans. So something that's going to stand is definitely critical for me. And also, getting back to that seed treatment component, I'm looking for a bean with a good disease tolerance too, particularly locally to sudden death syndrome. So those are really the two things I look for agronomically. Now, of course, agronomics are important, but I'm also looking for what's the highest yielding product. So this is a high yield management discussion. And so there's a lot of products out there within Asgrow, both from a Roundup Ready to Extend platform and a Roundup Ready to Extend Flex platform that we have out there today that are high yielding and have the agronomics to support those early planting scenarios.
Yeah, and it's great to see, in some of the work that's gone on, even in our area here and across the country, some of those new Asgrow Extend Flex soybeans starting to push 100 bushel for some of those folks who are really applying some of this stuff and doing it. And certainly, every operation is going to be different, but that opportunity to have that diverse germplasm available and really identify those right products, especially as we start to talk about how we use the rest of what's in our toolbox smarter. Mm-hmm. So speaking of the toolbox, a new thing available to us now moving forward obviously is that Extend Flex trait. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of weed control and how having that conversation, and what are the ways we need to look at that?
Yeah, so weed control is definitely something, especially as we're planting early, that we need to think about. Because, historically, we're hopefully coming in at a pre-application at planting and then following up with that post-application a few weeks later. The question I would pose to you as you're thinking through, hey, I'm going to try this strategy of planting early. I'm going to plant those soybeans really timely, because that's what I heard from DEKALB and Asgrow today. But what's your driver weed is something I would think of. So for me locally, and I would say throughout most of the Midwest or soybean growing regions, the amaranthus species are going to be really one of our driver weeds. And that'd be your Palmer amaranth or water hemp that I deal with here locally. And so if we're planting early, we're coming back a few weeks later with that post-application. When I look at this data that shows the emergence pattern of water hemp, is our residual or our application that's out there going to have good efficacy on that water hemp as it emerges? So if we're out there early and coming back with that early application, water hemp really doesn't emerge until, starting at the end of May and into June is where we see that. So historically, maybe you were getting successful control of water hemp through your weed control or herbicide application post. I think that we just need to think through what's that driver weed and how are we going to control that if we are pushing those planting dates into the early, April timeframe. Because I think that's something that, just having a good plan is something that's really going to help us out to get that good control. Now, something that we've implemented locally that I think really is key, and something that I think really helps with from a weed controls perspective, and 3 pillars that we like to promote here in Southern Illinois is start clean. So start clean with either tillage or a pre-application where you have a clean field as you get to planting. Spray clean, so instead of having that Sunday afternoon where you're driving around and trying to scout your field, see what weeds are up, and if you need to make that application, following up timely after you plant, definitely staying ahead of those weeds with a layered residual will help you from a weed control perspective, because it's easy to kill a lot easier to kill a weed that's not out of the ground yet. And that's really those, following those 2 pillars is how you stay clean throughout the rest of the year. And I think that's an integral part of high yield management.
Yeah, and we hear a lot of people, today talk about, the best kind of weed is a dead weed. I kind of like to subscribe to the theory of the best kind of weed is the weed that never emerges. Mm-hmm. And having spent a lot of time in the Boot Heel, Missouri and Southern Illinois, we talk to customers, they could be out on that Sunday afternoon scout, see some Palmer emerging, and by the time they get off the phone with their applicator or the time they go home and fill the sprayer, that thing's 4 inches tall and headed out. And so I think having that mindset of staying clean and spraying while we're still clean, certainly depending on how much you're managing and how many acres you're trying to get after, it doesn't always work perfectly, but certainly being able to go at it with that mindset will help you stay ahead of that and be able to keep things under a little bit better control. And don't give up on it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always better to be proactive than reactive.
Absolutely. So we've covered quite a few things here today, and want to remind everyone who's tuned in live now, you'll have a chance to ask questions. We're going to do a brief Q&A here at the end of the session, so go ahead and use that chat function and submit them. We've got folks piping the questions to us here in studio. So to kind of wrap things up, let's walk back through a little bit of kind of where we landed, because there's some key things here, and I think especially this time of year, it's easy to start thinking about, here in St. Louis, it's 70 degrees today. People are starting to get, it's the time of year where a warm day does a lot to get everybody a little antsy. So it's easy to sit focused on, okay, shoot, I got to get my plan together. When am I going to plant? What's my process going to be? But let's just kind of do a quick recap, walk back through kind of what those key things are before we get into some questions here.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say the number one thing is to plant timely. And so I usually say if you're comfortable to plant corn, I'm comfortable to plant soybeans. Like we've said a couple times, they're a lot tougher than you think. And I like to see those beans planted early. I think that really sets us up from a high yield management perspective. Choose the right product. So, I feel like very comfortable with some of the products that I have locally to really promote planting early, and they have the agronomics and that yield potential to really set themselves up nicely. And then invest in a seed treatment. So especially as we're pushing some of those earlier planting dates, having that protection from those early season diseases and insects is really key. And then make a weed control plan. And honestly, that's make a plan for in season, whether that's from weed control early season or as we get late and you're thinking about a fungicide, insecticide application, having that plan built in is really going to set yourself up for a successful harvest.
You know, Jamie, that's a good point, and you bring up something that maybe we didn't cover in as much detail, but could spend a little bit of time on now is something like an in-season fungicide application. We certainly talked about the season-long benefits that we can get from our seed treatment, especially when you think about things like SDS. I think, you know, unfortunately, some of us learned it the hard way, but we've learned over the last few years the value that that can give us when we get later in the season. All these things you mentioned, planting early, choosing the right product, are all good in principle, but if we've got an outbreak of SDS come later in the year, it kind of undoes it all for us. So as we think through, you know, the payoff on things like fungicide and or an insecticide, what do you recommend to growers and how they plan that out, and what have you seen locally in some of the trials you guys have done?
Yeah, so for me, a fungicide insecticide application, locally I'm targeting about that R3 growth stage. I know as we get further into northern Illinois, or even further north, I know we start dealing with white mold, which I don't deal with particularly in southern Illinois. For white mold, we're targeting more of that R1 growth stage. And, you know, I think that we, you know, talk about some of these early season tips and things to think about, but we have that yield potential and we definitely want to protect it as we go later into the season. And so having that application really protects that yield right on through to harvest.
So something else on the screen here that, and I like the way you've worded this, we talk a lot about planting early, but you use the word timely, and I think that was probably on purpose, right? I think it's easy to get spun up about getting going, want to start getting some seed in the ground, but at the end of the day, we understand planting timely, especially when you think about that corn window. What is that optimum corn window? Knowing that, as you heard Jamie say, the opportunity, if you're comfortable planting corn, you can probably plant some beans. And so being comfortable with knowing where your optimum window is for corn, maybe getting some beans in ahead of time, and then following that plan the rest of the way. So Jamie, thank you very much for the time today and the conversation. And we're certainly happy to open it up to questions from the audience now. So go ahead and get those submitted. And the first one we'll start with nitrogen. We talk about it a lot in corn. What's your stance on nitrogen in soybeans? How does that play into this overall plan of trying to get the highest yielding soybeans we can?
Yeah, that's a great question and one that comes up quite a bit in conversations that I have. So when we think about soybeans, of course, they are nitrogen fixing beans because they're legumes. So the nodules there are definitely going to fix that nitrogen, especially as we get into, you know, that V3 and later time frame. Some of the research that I've seen has said, you know, if we get into these really high yield environments, it's a little inconsistent about the return on investment versus the yield maybe bump that we get. You know, for me, you know, I think that the soybean definitely has can produce the nitrogen that we're going to need in most scenarios. You know, when we have nitrogen applied early, you know, sometimes we do see that nice greening effect. The beans are going to look really good early season, but does that ultimately lead to, you know, increased yield? If you're interested in applying nitrogen to your soybeans, you know, something I recommend really across the board is if you're going to try something new, you should always track it against maybe what your standard production practice is. And using Climate Field View is a really nice tool to be able to track some of those differences and really map out what's your return on investment and what's that yield increase that you're going to see with the nitrogen.
And probably another key point of how we think about having a plan and being able to stick with it gives us an opportunity to do some of those things, like try something different. So whether you're someone who maybe hasn't tried with some of that, tried some of that fungicide use in soybeans yet, or you're thinking about nitrogen, you know, being planful, having that plan put together and being able to then be flexible gives you an opportunity to do that. And don't be afraid to try something different, right? I think the best way we can learn, and especially with the way we can track it now, is being able to try new things and see what works and what doesn't, and move on from there. So another question we had, talked about planting early, we talked about seed treatments. What about planting populations? We certainly have heard it a lot in corn. What does, one, the planting window earlier do to your thoughts around planting population? And two, kind of, is that something we should be worried about if we're going to take on this earlier planted soybeans?
Yeah, so typically as we're planting earlier, you know, we are really thinking about what's that final stand going to be in soybeans. A lot of the data that's out there is going to show that anywhere from about 80,000 to 100,000 final stand is really going to still have about 100% of that overall yield potential. So I think we've learned a lot that soybeans can definitely compensate for, pulling back on some of the populations. So planting early, I would say you're still going to want to target, that final stand of about 100,000. So of course, depending on your equipment, we're going to get that nice emergence with adding a seed treatment, so that's definitely going to help, but we are maybe in some tougher conditions. So I would work locally of figuring out exactly where you think that your population needs to be, but just as an overall trend, typically earlier, I'm kind of pulling back the population, just letting those soybeans really compensate, get really nice vegetative growth. And then as we move later into the season, I'm starting to bump up some of those populations. And in my neck of the woods, we have a lot of double crop beans as well. And so as we get, to that late June type planting, then I'm really increasing the population to really get those nodes out there and those plants out there.
Good to know. So we've talked about a lot: planting timeliness, seed treatment, product selection, weed control, fungicide, nitrogen. If I wanted to pick one place to start, what would your recommendation be? Say I've consistently been somebody who plants my beans after I get my corn done, want to make sure everything's right. You know what? I want to do something a little bit different this year. I want to put a little more into my beans. Where would you start?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different routes that you can go. Certainly, if you have the capabilities and the equipment to be able to plant timely or plant either at the same time as your corn or maybe even a little before, that's something that's really pretty inexpensive to do if you already have the capabilities. If that's something that you're saying, I don't have the equipment or manpower to be planting at the same time, or I'm still going to plant my corn first, I think really, you could try a combination of some of those different factors. You maybe already have a seed treatment on. So I would say maybe invest in that weed control plan. Make sure you've got yourself set up with a good plan from that perspective. And then, you can always focus later in the season. If you're somebody that hasn't applied a fungicide, insecticide in the past on your beans, maybe that's something you try. And like I said earlier, leaving that, untreated or standard practice is a really nice way to keep a standard or, a check to understand, what's, like I said, really that ROI and what's that yield bump that you're getting.
Good. So we talked about a lot already. I'm going to throw one more at you. Sulfur. What do we do?
Yeah, so sulfur, there's a lot of research that's looked at sulfur in soybeans. Of course, in the past, before all of the clean energy and type of bills that Clean Air Acts and everything else that has come into play, we were historically getting our sulfur from the air. Now, with some of the cleaner air and less emissions that we have, we're really going to have to start relying on some of these inputs of sulfur to get us to where we need to be. Sulfur is still a really major component when we think through fertility for both corn and soybeans. I know some research, especially out of Purdue University, has shown that, a sulfur application, they're seeing really nice responses in soybeans particularly. So I think, a lot of guys are starting to have interest in applying that sulfur to their soybeans. A lot of that's being applied really close to planting or very early in the growing season. And one of the benefits is you get, possibly if you're applying an AMS type product, you get a little bit of that nitrogen and sulfur in a combination. So a really nice thing to think about, and especially to continue to try as we look into these, different fertility programs moving forward in soybeans.
Absolutely. Well, Jamie, thank you very much for your time today. A lot of really great insights there, and hopefully got some folks thinking a little bit differently about how they manage their soybeans. I think corn tends to be the star sometimes, and so really want to understand that there's an opportunity to make just as big a yields on the soybean side of things and do it in a practical way, right? We can talk a lot about throwing everything you got in the kitchen sink, but at the end of the day, there's a good practical way, and following some of these agronomic tips from Jamie, to really help boost your soybean yields. And I gotta give you credit, you even got the Boilermaker reference in there. So well done. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. We're glad you could be here. It's been a lot of fun. Certainly, we wish we were on the Riverwalk and enjoying a margarita afterwards, but excited about the opportunity to be back with you again next year, hopefully in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, and having a good time in person again. So thank you for your business. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll throw it back to Daryl.